Picture two women. Same age, both in their mid-60s. Same city. Both retired. Both with grown children who live within an hour's drive. The first woman's weekend fills up almost on its own. Her daughter calls Tuesday to say she's coming Saturday. Her son texts asking if she has plans Sunday. There are grandchildren who ask when they can sleep over. Her house has that particular kind of noise, the good kind, the kind that comes from people who want to be there. The second woman checks her phone more than she admits. She tells herself her children are busy. She tells herself this is just how modern families are. She rearranges the guest room sometimes, just in case. She waits for a visit that keeps getting postponed. Same city, same generation. Very different lives. Now here's what I want you to notice. The difference between these two women is not their children. It is not luck or geography or whether their children are good people. Both sets of children love their mothers. I'm certain of that. The difference, and I've seen this across more than 4 decades of clinical work with families, is habit. Specific learnable habits that change what it feels like to be in relationship with you. Habits that determine whether a visit leaves your child feeling light and glad they came, or quietly exhausted and a little relieved to go home. Today, I want to share 4 of those habits with you. Not theory, not platitudes. The real psychology of why some parents' homes become places their adult children return to again and again, and what you can start doing differently, starting today. Let's begin. Before we get to the 4 habits, I need to address something that I know many of you are carrying. If your adult children visit less than you'd like, or if contact has become sparse, surface level, or strained, it is very tempting to conclude one of 2 things. Either your children are selfish and ungrateful, or you did something terribly wrong as a parent. I've sat across from hundreds of parents who have landed on one of those 2 conclusions. And I want to tell you gently but clearly, both of those stories are almost never the full truth. Here is what the psychology actually shows us. Adult children are living in a state of compression. Work, marriage, their own children, financial pressure, digital overload, their lives are genuinely full. And when bandwidth is limited, the brain becomes very efficient about one thing. It prioritizes the relationships that give energy, and it quietly avoids the ones that cost energy. This is not cruelty. This is neuroscience. When a visit with a parent consistently leaves an adult child feeling criticized, managed, guilty, indebted, or emotionally drained, the brain starts to learn something. It builds an association. This relationship equals depletion. And over time, the body starts to resist initiating contact before the mind even registers why. I've watched this happen in family after family. The child doesn't stop visiting because they love their parent less. They stop visiting because every visit costs more than it gives. The good news, and I mean this, is that this dynamic can be reversed. Not through pressure, not through guilt, but through these 4 habits that gradually, genuinely change what it feels like to be your child's parent. Let's look at the first one. Habit 1. They make the visit feel safe, not supervised. The most visited parents I have ever observed share one quality that is both simple and, I'll be honest, genuinely difficult to practice. They hold their tongue at the exact moment their instinct tells them to speak. Think about what typically happens during a family visit. Your daughter mentions she's been letting your grandchildren stay up later than you think is wise. Your son says something about a financial decision that makes you catch your breath. Your daughter-in-law serves the children something you privately consider nutritionally questionable. And the instinct, the very powerful, very well-intentioned instinct, is to say something. After all, you have 40 or 50 years of experience. You've made the mistakes already. You know how this ends. Why wouldn't you share that? I call this the supervisor trap. And it is one of the most common and most invisible reasons adult children begin spacing out their visits. Here's what your child experiences when you offer unsolicited feedback, even gentle feedback, even loving feedback during a visit. They experience evaluation. they experience the feeling of being monitored. And however much they love you, there is a part of every adult brain that is wired to resist surveillance, to pull away from any relationship where they do not feel free. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, showed us something profound about human bonding. Secure attachment, the kind that draws people toward each other, requires felt safety. Not just physical safety, emotional safety. The felt sense that I can be myself here without being corrected, managed, or assessed. The parents whose children visit most often have, sometimes consciously, sometimes through hard-won experience, learned to create that safety. Not by being passive, not by pretending they have no opinions, but by choosing, again and again, to be a presence rather than a position. There is a practical technique I give parents in my practice. I call it the 60-second window. When something happens during a visit that triggers your instinct to comment, pause. Give yourself 60 seconds before speaking. Ask yourself one question: will this comment serve my child, or will it serve my need to feel useful? Most of the time, you'll find that what felt urgent at 10 seconds feels optional at 60. And what you'll build, over visit after visit, is something your child may not be able to name, but will feel deeply. They'll notice that being around you doesn't require them to defend their choices, that they can exhale in your presence, that your home is a place where they're welcomed as an adult, not evaluated as a child still in progress. That feeling is magnetic. That feeling is what makes people call on a Tuesday and say, "I'll be there Saturday." Habit 2. They give without keeping score. Years ago, I worked with a woman, I'll call her Margaret, who could not understand why her son visited so rarely. She was generous by every external measure. She cooked elaborate meals when he came. She helped with money when they needed it. She drove across town to babysit without being asked. But in our sessions, something else emerged. Every act of generosity was followed, sometimes immediately, sometimes weeks later, by a sentence that began with the words, "After everything I've done for you." She wasn't even aware she was saying it. It had become reflex, a way of expressing hurt, of bridging the gap between what she gave and what she received in return. But what her son heard, every time, was an invoice. I call this the invisible ledger. And I want you to consider, honestly, whether you keep one. The invisible ledger is the running account of sacrifices made, gifts given, inconveniences absorbed, all of it quietly tallied, waiting to be acknowledged. The ledger doesn't have to be spoken aloud to be felt. Adult children are extraordinarily sensitive to the energy of unspoken debt. They feel the weight of it in the pauses between sentences, in the way a gift is handed over, in the sigh that comes after a kind act. And what the ledger does, over months, over years, is transform love into transaction. It turns relationship into obligation. And obligation, as any psychologist will tell you, is one of the most reliable engines of avoidance. Erik Erikson, whose work on the stages of adult development I return to constantly in my practice, described the central task of later life as the tension between integrity and despair. Parents who have arrived at integrity give freely, not because they don't feel the longing to be seen, but because they have made peace with the asymmetry of the parent-child relationship. They understand that what they gave in raising their children was not a loan. It was a gift, an unconditional one. Parents still in despair, still negotiating, still calculating, give in ways that ask to be repaid. And their children feel that ask, even when it's never spoken. Here is the shift I invite you to make. The next time you do something for your child, cook, give, drive, show up, try to notice what you're expecting in return. Not what you deserve, what you're expecting. And then, just for that moment, try to release the expectation entirely. Not as a performance, not to prove something, but because the gift that asks for nothing is the rarest and most powerful form of love. And your child, even if they can't articulate why, will feel it in their bones. Margaret, by the way, eventually learned to catch herself before the invoice came out. It took time. It took genuine grief about what she was letting go. But the last time I heard from her, her son was coming for dinner every other week. Habit 3. They stay curious instead of conclusive. Let me describe a certain kind of parent that adult children find quietly exhausting to spend time with. This parent loves their child deeply. They're not cold, not withholding, not overtly critical. But there is something in every conversation that feels already decided. You mention a new project at work, and before you finish the sentence, they've already assessed whether it's a good idea. You share a worry, and they've already diagnosed the solution. You describe a relationship, and they've already formed an opinion. There's no space in the conversation to actually be anything other than what they've already concluded you are. I call this the conclusive parent pattern, and it is far more common than the overtly critical parent, and in some ways harder to recognize because it often comes wrapped in love and experience and genuine care. But here is what it communicates at the deepest level. I already know who you are. I don't need to ask. And to an adult child who is actively in the process of becoming, building a career, navigating a marriage, raising children, discovering who they are at 40 or 50, that message is profoundly isolating. Contrast that with the parent who asks questions, real questions. Not the leading questions that are really opinions in disguise. Don't you think you're taking on too much? But genuine questions. Questions that start with "tell me more." Questions that reveal actual curiosity about who this person is becoming. Curiosity is one of the most underestimated acts of respect available to a parent. It says, I don't assume I have you figured out. I'm still interested. I still want to know. In my clinical work, I use a concept I call the witness stance. It describes the practice of observing your child's life, their choices, their struggles, their growth, without feeling the need to edit it. To be present with them as they are, not as you imagined they would be or as you think they should be. Parents who have developed the witness stance don't need to agree with everything their child does. But they've learned that the relationship itself, the warmth, the connection, the desire to keep showing up, is more precious than any particular opinion they might have about how their child is living. Here is a simple practice. In your next visit with your adult child, before you offer any advice or share any opinion, ask 3 genuine questions. Questions you don't already know the answer to. Questions that invite them to show you something about their life you haven't seen yet. You may be surprised by what comes back. You may discover a person you know less well than you thought, and in the best possible way. Habit 4. They build a life worth visiting into. This 4th habit is the one that, in my experience, takes the longest to accept because it runs counter to what many parents believe love looks like in later life. There is a particular kind of emptiness that can settle into a parent's life when the children have left and the years have moved forward. The house is quieter. The schedule is thinner. The things that once gave structure, school pickups, dinner rotations, weekend activities, have all moved on. And in that quiet, it can begin to feel as though waiting is the main event. Waiting for calls, waiting for visits, waiting for the family to need you again. I understand this deeply. It is not a failure of character. It is a natural response to a profound life transition. But here is what I need to say as clearly as I can, because I have watched this pattern play out in family after family. When a parent's world contracts to the point that their children become their primary source of meaning, the children feel it. And it changes everything about how they experience the relationship. Not because they don't care, but because no adult, no matter how loving, can sustain the weight of being someone's entire world. It is too much. It is a weight the body registers even when the mind doesn't want to admit it. And over time, that weight makes visits feel like obligation rather than desire. Viktor Frankl, whose work I have returned to throughout my entire career, taught us that meaning is not optional in human life. It is not a luxury for people with easy circumstances. It is a biological and psychological necessity, and it becomes even more essential, not less, as we age. The parents whose children visit most often, and I want you to hear this, are almost never the ones who are waiting. They are the ones who have something going on. A project they're excited about. A community they're woven into. A practice, creative, physical, spiritual, that gives their days momentum. A passion they're pursuing with genuine investment. And here is what adult children feel when they encounter a parent who is thriving in this way: relief, admiration, and, this is the part that surprises people, a genuine desire to be near that energy. There is something deeply attractive about a person who is alive in their own right, who has things to tell you about that aren't about you, who is curious about the world, who laughs with genuine delight, who is still becoming. I'm not asking you to perform happiness. I'm not asking you to pretend that loss and longing aren't real. They are real, and they deserve to be honored. But I am asking you to consider, what would it mean to invest in your own life with the same seriousness that you invest in your relationship with your children? A class you've been meaning to take. A friendship that's gone quiet that you could rekindle. A creative project that has waited long enough. A community, a congregation, a club, a volunteer circle, where you are known and needed. Any one of these things changes the chemistry of what your child walks into when they visit. Instead of a parent who needs something from them, they find a parent who has something to give, who is interesting, who has stories that aren't about grievances, who makes them feel, when they leave, that they've been enriched. That, I promise you, is someone they will want to come back to. Let me bring these 4 habits together, because separately, they are practices, but together, they describe something larger. They describe a way of being. Safe to be around. Generous without ledgers. Curious instead of conclusive. Alive in your own right. This is not a checklist to perform before the next visit. It is a slow, patient reorientation of who you are in relationship, of what you offer when your child walks through the door, of what they carry with them when they leave. Do you remember the 2 women I described at the beginning of this conversation? The one whose home fills on its own, and the one who waits by the quiet phone. I want to tell you something important about both of them. Neither of them is a better person than the other. Neither loves their children more. The difference between their lives is not the children they raised, or the circumstances they faced, or the luck they were handed. The difference is practice. Repeated, imperfect, sometimes difficult practice. The habit of pausing before speaking, of giving without accounting, of staying curious when it would be easier to conclude, of building a life that has its own light. I've been doing this work for over 40 years. And in all that time, the one thing I can tell you with complete certainty is this: you cannot force anyone to come home, but you can become the kind of person they want to come home to. And that is something entirely within your reach. Before you go, I'd love to know, which of these 4 habits felt most familiar to you, and which one genuinely surprised you? Leave it in the comments below. I read them. And your perspective helps shape the conversations we have on this channel every week. If today's video gave you something to think about, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. A friend, a sibling, someone in your community who is navigating this particular kind of longing. And if you're new to Strong Elderly Life, welcome. Every week, we explore the real psychology behind family relationships, emotional independence, and what it means to live with depth and intention after 60. Not the version that just tells you what you want to hear, but the version that actually helps. Subscribe, and we'll keep this conversation going. Take care of yourselves. And I'll see you in the next one.